Hello, everyone. Thank you for hopping on today. We're going to wait a couple minutes while everybody else joins right now. Hi, thanks for joining, everybody. We're going to wait a couple more minutes. It looks like we're missing some of the registrants. So thank you so much for joining us today, and just hang tight for a minute. All right, I think we seem to be holding firm right there. So we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. This is the Orange County APA Annual Legislative Update. My name is Amber Gregg with Amber Gregg Planning and Entitlements, and I am the Legislative Liaison Co-Chair for the chapter, and I'm joined by Patrick Cruz, who is my fellow Co-Chair with Judic Consulting in the Orange County office. With so many new laws coming out every year, this is always a much needed and much welcome session. I know I always love this session. And luckily, we have the amazing dynamic duo legal team of David Snow and Diana Verrett joining us again. And they are from RWG Law Firm. And they're here to help guide us through all the new and upcoming requirements. So just a brief introduction on both of them. A lot of you will probably recognize David Snow. He specializes in land use and CEQA. Dave has been practicing for nearly 20 years, and he originally started as a land use planner. Dave is at the forefront of legislation in California and provides vital feedback and guidance for APA on the legislative review team on proposed legislation. Diana Verrett was also a previous urban planner. I think that's why we like them so much, because they're planners at heart, and has advised dozens of public agencies in California on complex land use and housing matters. And since the state's passage of the 2017 housing bill, Diana has focused her practice on compliance with California's housing-related land use laws, including the Housing Element Law, Housing Accountability Act, no net loss provisions, and SB 35. So thank you both so much for joining us again today. We're happy to have you. And as we go through this presentation, I just wanted to let everybody know that on the right-hand side, there's a place for you to enter your questions. And at the end of the presentation, we will be taking those questions. So please go ahead and type in there. And this is being recorded, so it will be available on the APA website in the next couple of days. So please take a look at it there. And we'll go ahead and turn it over to Diana. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amber, and thank you everyone for joining us virtually here today. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video camera, as I believe everyone else on the panelist link here, so that you can just focus on the PowerPoint, which of course will be available later. Hopefully that has, now you can all just see the PowerPoint and not my face. Here's what we're going to do today. We're going to go through a number of pieces of legislation that became effective for the most part on January 1st, 2020. And so I'm going to start us off with a few of the housing and planning related bills. And I'll start with the Housing Crisis Act, commonly known as Senate Bill 330. talk a little bit about a number of the accessory dwelling unit laws, and then briefly talk about some minor changes to density bonus law. Then I'll touch on the changes to the Surplus Lands Act and some website requirements related to planning and zoning. And then I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dave, and he's going to continue on with some new information about safety element updates, emergency evacuation routes, some minor changes to CEQA that occurred last year, and then just briefly some other laws at the end, including low barrier navigation centers, what that term is, and how we need to address them at this point. So let's dive in with Senate Bill 330. In this piece of legislation, the state declared a statewide housing emergency for the next 5 years. So what that means is for the period 2020 to 2025, SB 330 essentially seeks to encourage the development of more housing, and specifically more affordable housing, as well as support the retention of existing housing and existing affordable housing by expediting housing approvals through a couple of means, which I'll talk about, by suspending local authority to impose certain restrictions on housing development, and then by requiring replacement units in projects that are proposed on sites that already have existing housing on them. So I want to start briefly by mentioning the provision of SB 330 that applies to all development projects that are subject to the Permit Streamlining Act. So SB 330 amended the Housing Accountability Act, the Permit Streamlining Act, and then enacted a number of other new provisions, including the last part called the Housing Crisis Act. So this first part really deals with the processing of applications under the Permit Streamlining Act. And to expedite the process specifically of housing development projects, SB 330 creates, within the Permit Streamlining Act, a new preliminary application process. It also limits the number of hearings a local agency can hold when considering a housing development project, and requires agencies to make an upfront determination when required of whether the site proposed for housing is a historic site or not. So to expedite approvals for all types of project, SB 330 made a couple of changes to the Permit Streamlining Act. And as most of you know, generally under the Permit Streamlining Act, a public agency must provide an applicant with a list of items that were not complete in a submitted application within 30 days of receiving that application. So under SB 330, this incompleteness letter explicitly has to include an exhaustive list of the items that were not complete. And the agency may only identify items that were incomplete if those items are mentioned in the agency's submittal checklist for that type of application. So it's really especially important at this point for public agencies to review and update their completeness checklists for all development projects sooner rather than later. SB 330 also restricts the local agency's ability to add anything new to a subsequent incompleteness letter that was not specifically mentioned in a prior incompleteness letter. And so this just puts a little bit more of a burden on planning staff to make sure that upfront they're focusing on what needs to be submitted and whether that's been submitted. Under a separate bill that I'll mention later, AB 1483, agencies must now have both those checklists for all projects on their websites. So I'll come back to that a little bit later. But of course, SB 330 focuses primarily on housing. So I'm going to move on to the housing specific provisions of SB 330. And I want to remind you all of a definition that comes from the Housing Accountability Act, which has not been amended. So that still is the same, this definition of housing development project. And it includes uses that consist of residential units only, some mixed use developments if 2/3 of the square footage of the project is for residential uses, and then transitional and supportive housing projects. So it's important to understand that definition because this next procedural part of SB 330 applies only to these housing development projects. And that is that to expedite these types of applications, SB 330 creates a new preliminary application process. And honestly, it's less about expediting and more about providing certainty for applicants of proposed housing development projects so that they know exactly what standards will apply to their project. So these applicants now may, but do not have to, submit a preliminary application. And state law expressly lists all of the various components of what makes a preliminary application compliant. And so if that application has all of the statutorily required information, and if the applicant pays the permit processing fee, the applicant will have the certainty that they will be subject only to the standards that were in place at the time that preliminary application that complies with state law was submitted to the public agency. And of course, this doesn't mean that a local agency can't change their regulations at all. It just means they can't apply later enacted policies or standards to that specific project. And to maintain the benefits of that sort of freezing of development standards, the applicant has to submit a complete application within essentially 6 months. So that's where the expediting the approval part maybe comes in, to attempt to sort of get those applicants a little bit of certainty, but also make sure they're moving forward with their applications sooner rather than later. So as I mentioned, the primary purpose here is to freeze the development standards for those applications. But there are a number of later enacted standards that state law explicitly says a local agency still may apply, even if a project has submitted a compliant preliminary application. So for example, if the city or county has a fee schedule that has an impact fee with an automatic adjustment for changes in the consumer price index, the city may impose those adjustments of the fees. They can impose CEQA mitigation measures to avoid or lessen a significant impact under CEQA. This standard for specific adverse impact is sort of the same as the Housing Accountability Act standard generally. So if there's a written objective standard that only could be avoided if the agency imposes a later enacted standard, and that would be to avoid a specific adverse impact, the agency has the authority to do that. But again, it's dependent on there being a written objective standard to avoid an impact to public health and safety. So there's a couple more, but I'll leave those in the slide at this point and move on. So another way that the SB 330 attempts to encourage the development of housing and expedite the approval of housing is by limiting the number of hearings that a public agency can hold for proposed housing development projects. So for a proposed housing development project, the public agency may not hold more than 5 hearings for that project after the time that it is deemed complete. This includes public hearings that are continued. So if you have a planning commission that's considering a housing development project approval, and they decide they need more information and want to continue that to a subsequent meeting, that counts as 2 of the 5 hearings. Interestingly and importantly, this limit on the number of hearings does not apply if the applicant needs a legislative approval. For example, an amendment to a general plan, a specific plan, or the zoning code. So while this attempts to expedite housing development projects essentially that comply with existing objective standards, it does not mandate that the city only hold 5 hearings if there are sort of legislative policy decisions that need to be made in connection with those projects. One other interesting thing is how the housing approval timelines have been shortened. So with respect to projects that require EIRs, state law already limited the amount of time after which the EIR was certified and within which the local agency had to actually approve the project. And of course, most public agencies certify the EIR and approve the project on the same date. So this doesn't come up all that often. But now agencies have to be careful that if they don't do that, they approve the project or take action on the project within these timelines, within 60 or 90 days after certifying the EIR. So the next part of the housing account or SB 330 is called the Housing Crisis Act. And this is the new provision of the government code that was added 66-300, which applies only to affected cities and counties. But that term and the determination by HCD of which cities and counties in the state count as affected cities and counties really covers most urbanized areas and most cities and counties in the state. And what it does for those jurisdictions is twofold. It prohibits them from restricting housing and residential density in certain ways. And that's an attempt to encourage the development of new housing. And then it requires that those agencies impose on new housing development projects a replacement unit requirement if that site of that housing development project that's being proposed already includes existing housing. And the idea there, right, is to retain the existing housing and the existing affordable housing that agencies have. So I'll speak first to local authority and how that's limited in the next 5 years. So for the next 5 years, affected cities and counties may not reduce allowable intensity in any land use designation in the general plan or zoning district, or downzone any specific property, essentially from a multifamily to a single family use, or reduce the intensity of the use within that zone below what was allowed on January 1st, 2018. And the idea here is to maintain the residential capacity, the number of units we could have built on January 1st, 2018, which was the effective date of the new package of housing bills that went into effect in that first round in 2017. And so the idea is we just don't want to go below that capacity. We want to be increasing the opportunity for housing to get built, not decreasing that opportunity. There's a caveat here, which is that an agency can reduce allowable intensity in a specific designation or district, or downzone a specific property if it simultaneously upzones or increases intensity in other designations or districts to demonstrate that there's been no net loss in residential capacity, which is an important thing for public agencies to understand, that they can change the zoning for specific properties or reduce the intensity in one specific zone if they're being strategic about how they're making up for that potential loss in residential capacity. So the second group of prohibited local actions under the Housing Crisis Act includes a number of things. And for the next 5 years, affected cities and counties may not impose a moratorium on housing, except in instances with HCD approval. They cannot limit the number of approvals or construction permits for housing that can be issued in a specific area of the city, or cap the number of housing units that can be issued permits in a specific time. And they can't explicitly limit the jurisdiction's population. So this is all obviously intended to make sure that we retain the possibility for housing to get built. The last one is a little interesting. The law so far has not wholly prevented public agencies from imposing subjective standards or discretionary review on projects. The HAA, the Housing Accountability Act, already limited agencies' discretionary review to some extent before January 1st. But now after January 1st, state law says that public agencies that are affected cities and counties cannot adopt subjective design standards. So if you're revising your design standards at this point, they need to be objective standards. And the idea here, I think, is the idea that the state wants us to be moving towards streamlined ministerial review to the extent possible. So if local jurisdictions are trying to streamline or amend their standards, they should be moving from subjective to objective standards. So that's the first part of the Housing Crisis Act, and the second part is this part regarding replacement units. So what it does is actually prohibit affected cities and counties from approving housing development projects unless they replace all of the existing dwelling units that are on the site. And that's basically saying if there's 10 units on the site now, whatever you're proposing to replace those 10 units with has to be at least 10 units if you're proposing a housing development project. There are also affordability requirements. So if the site currently contains housing that is considered protected units, and the proposed housing development project would require the demolition of those protected units, then the public agency must comply with a set of replacement unit requirements based on affordability that cross-reference the replacement unit requirements in the density bonus law. And there's a lot of details there, and it can be very confusing. I first just want to show you what the protected units definition is. I'm not going to go into what the detailed requirements are, but just know that anytime a public agency is approving a housing development project on a site where there are existing units, if those units are protected units, there are going to be some extra hoops that the city is going to need to consider, or the county is going to need to consider, and that the applicant, the developer, should build into their project analysis and pro forma, because it may affect their bottom line if a number of their units actually need to be deed restricted as affordable housing. So protected units, for the most part, are units either subject to an affordability covenant, subject to rent control, units that are known to be occupied by low or very low income households in the last 5 years, or units that have been withdrawn from the rental market under the Ellis Act in the past 10 years. So whenever a site includes those types of protected units, just be mindful of the limitations for a local agency approving that project, and the need to make sure that that proposed project deed restricts a certain percentage of the new units based on the replacement unit requirements in 66-300. A couple of caveats to SB 330. SB 330 explicitly says that agencies retain authority over housing development projects in very high fire hazard severity zones. So just know that there's sort of an exception there. And agencies absolutely still may adopt policies that allow greater density and encourage housing. And most importantly, the Coastal Act and CEQA remain intact explicitly in this provision. And so cities must continue complying with the CEQA requirements to analyze significant impacts and impose and implement mitigation measures under CEQA to reduce significant impacts when necessary. So that is SB 330, and I'm going to run through the ADU bills next. Accessory dwelling unit law has been amended a few times in the last few years. And in 2017, when the legislature amended the law, what they did was try to ask local agencies, or require local agencies, to come up with objective standards and a ministerial process by which ADUs could be approved. And so that was sort of the framework at that point, that local agencies would adopt an ordinance that complied with state law and created a ministerial process. Under that provision, there was also a sort of an even more streamlined process for conversions of existing space. So if you were converting a garage or converting a room in your existing single-family home into an ADU, there were very streamlined procedures already set out in state law. I see this new round of ADU bills as sort of flipping all of that on its head and putting most of the potential ADUs that might be approved into that building permit only process where only state standards apply. And then there's the opportunity for a local agency to establish local ADU standards that comply with state law. But that's sort of only applicable if the ADU that's being proposed does not fall into the category of ADUs that can be approved through the building permit only provision, which is subsection E of 65852.2 of the Government Code. So I want to start with those because I think it's easiest to think about what are the things that you have to approve as a local agency. So the first category sort of follows up on that existing category or pre-existing category about conversions of existing space. And so that is the first category where a property owner gets one ADU or a junior ADU on a lot either within a proposed single family dwelling, so where the property owner is proposing a single family dwelling at the same time as that ADU or JADU, or within existing space of an existing single family dwelling, so they're converting space of an existing single family dwelling. And then finally, if they're converting existing space of an accessory structure, for example, a garage or pool house. And this time, the state explicitly said that that can go beyond the size of the existing accessory structure up to 150 square feet if it's necessary for ingress or egress. There are very limited standards that apply to these particular types of ADUs. So all that has to be demonstrated is that there's exterior access, that they have side and rear setbacks that are acceptable for fire and safety. And then a junior ADU has to comply with all the provisions of state law, which I'll talk about in a moment. And of course, at the end of the day, the building code and the building standards still apply. So that is what cities are going to be focusing on for the most part for these building permit only ADUs. So to clarify, a junior accessory dwelling unit is essentially an ADU contained entirely within the walls of the single family residence. So it's an attached ADU within the single family residence that's smaller potentially than other ADUs because it cannot be larger than 500 square feet. It has to have a very minimal cooking facility with sort of cabinets, a countertop, and appliances. And the big difference is that it may have its own bathroom or it may share a bathroom with the main residence. So you could have a door from the JADU into the main residence by which the resident of the JADU uses an internal bathroom. Also, just one note, state law at the moment still explicitly says that a JADU property has to be owner occupied. I'll talk about that in a moment because with respect to ADUs, the public agencies no longer have the authority to apply the owner occupancy requirement, but that owner occupancy requirement still exists within 65852.22 with respect to JADUs. So that's the first category of ADUs and JADUs that have to be issued without regard for local standards, just through a building permit. The big difference this time is that it's not just attached existing conversions that get these processes, but now the second category is that an applicant can get a detached new ADU that is no larger than 800 square feet, no higher than 16 feet, and meets a minimal setback requirement of only 4 feet from the side and rear lot lines. And so long as the proposed ADU meets those minimal requirements, the applicant gets a building permit for that ADU. State law also says that you get that detached new ADU plus a JADU, so that you might have 3 units on a lot, an 800 square foot detached ADU and a 500 square foot potentially JADU within the single family home. So the second, or the third and fourth categories relate to ADUs on multifamily property. And this was not explicitly required before, but now there are 2 categories under the multifamily property ADUs in the building permit only provision. And agencies must allow the conversion of non-livable space in existing multifamily structures. So for example, if you have basements, garages, storage rooms of a multifamily property that could be turned into livable space and could essentially be converted to comply with state building standards, then the agency has to allow the property owner to convert that space at least into one ADU and possibly up to 25% of the existing number of multifamily dwelling units in the existing building. So what that means is essentially if you have an 8-unit apartment building that has garage space or storage space that could be converted into ADUs, the agency has to allow them to build 2 ADUs, right? 25% of the existing number. And then the last category is detached ADUs on a lot with existing multifamily structures. And again, they get up to 2 detached ADUs that are subject to a 16-foot height limit and the 4-foot side and rear yard setbacks. But if they meet those requirements, they get their building permit for those developments. So if the building permit only process applies, the local agency may not impose any other local planning standards, except they definitely still can impose building code requirements. The agencies also cannot require the correction of non-conforming zoning conditions. I think there's a distinction here between non-conforming zoning conditions and illegal structures, but the agency cannot require the correction of non-conforming zoning conditions. And then finally, if an applicant gets their building permit through this building permit only process, the agency must require that the rental be for a period of longer than 30 days. So the idea here is to increase the stock of housing in the state, not to increase the potential for short-term rentals. So these are the categories that I sort of call the building permit only ADUs. And the local agency still has to process ADUs that are being proposed, even if they don't fit into that category, if they fit under subsection A of Government Code 65852.2, which establishes sort of the local standards or the maximum sort of local standards for public agencies to consider ADUs that don't fall within that building permit only category. So under these provisions, the agencies are essentially either limited to not having their own ordinance and approving ADUs that comply with the minimal standards in subsection A, or adopting a local ordinance and establishing local standards so long as those standards don't conflict with the standards in subsection A. And under these provisions, the agency also may designate where in the city ADUs may be permitted or not permitted. And they make that designation based on the adequacy of water and sewer service and the potential impact of ADUs on traffic flow and public safety. So you could imagine in certain cities with narrow streets and in fire zones that you might want to restrict the development in that area to make sure that there's still adequate evacuation routes and those sorts of things. So those sorts of determinations can be made under the local standards. And under state law, this process still has to be a ministerial process. The agency cannot establish discretionary review for the ADUs that qualify under subsection A. The agency must approve the ADU within 60 days of receiving a completed application. And if they get an application at the same time for an ADU and a proposed single family dwelling that actually requires discretionary review, the agency now explicitly can go through that discretionary review process for the single family home first, and then proceed to considering the ADU through the ministerial review process second. With respect to the actual standards that an agency can incorporate into the local ordinance, agencies no longer have the authority to require a minimum lot size. So you can't say you only get an ADU if your lot is larger than 8,000 square feet or something like that. Explicitly now, as I mentioned before, agencies cannot require owner occupancy for ADUs. If a property owner is converting a garage into an ADU, the agencies no longer have the authority to require that the applicant replace that loss of parking for the single family home on the property. And then finally, the state law says that local agencies cannot impose floor area ratio, lot coverage, or other similar requirements in a way that prevents an 800 square foot ADU. So we interpret this to mean that you can impose those requirements so long as it doesn't prohibit that 800 square foot ADU. With respect to the size of ADUs, there's some maximums in state law, about 1,200 square feet for detached, though in the local ordinance, the city or county may reduce that to 850 square feet for studio and 1-bedroom ADUs, or 1,000 square feet for 2+ bedroom ADUs. And then there's a specific provision about how big the attached ADU should be if there's an existing single family dwelling on the property. With respect to setbacks, agencies are limited to a maximum of 4-foot side and rear yard setbacks. And then there's an additional sort of limitation for converting existing structures or existing living space. So you don't have to require them to, or you can't require them to comply with any additional setback. And that is also the case if the applicant is proposing to demolish an existing structure and then reconstruct a new ADU in that same location and to the same dimensions. Agencies don't have a lot of discretion with respect to requiring parking. At this point, an agency cannot require more than 1 parking space. And there are a lot of caveats to that. Even if you can require a parking space for the ADU, you cannot require that 1 parking space if you're within a half-a-mile walking distance of public transit, which includes a near bus stop, if you're within a historic district, or if it's an attached or converted accessory structure. So there's a lot of limitations on parking requirements. And then now explicitly with respect to impact fees, agencies cannot impose impact fees on ADUs that are under 750 square feet. For ADUs that are larger than that, the agencies may impose impact fees so long as those fees are proportional to the square footage of the primary dwelling. And then there are some limitations with respect to when agencies can impose requirements with respect to capacity charges and new utility connections. It's really only going to be considered a new use if it's proposed with a new single family dwelling. So if an agency decides it wants to adopt that local ordinance, there's some state oversight at this point, and the agency is required to send that ordinance to HCD for their review within 60 days after adopting that ordinance. The cities and counties now explicitly can use ADUs towards the production of units for the purpose of reporting progress under the Regional Housing Needs Assessment compliance reporting that's done every April. It's not clear, and there's no explicit nature in the legislation or the regulation so far as to what that means for affordability. It just means you can use them as a unit. And then with respect to ADUs, there's sort of a separate bill that was passed last year that puts restrictions on homeowners associations. So a lot of homeowners associations around the state have provisions in their CC&Rs that either prohibit or restricted ADUs entirely. This law stated that those restrictions are no longer enforceable if they prohibit an ADU or JADU on single family lots that comply with state law. They also can't unreasonably restrict the construction of ADUs and JADUs. And so the parameters there are not entirely clear. Homeowners associations still have authority to impose reasonable restrictions. And I imagine we'll be seeing some litigation on that point potentially in the coming years. So that's ADUs. And I'm going to move right along here because we have a lot to cover and talk about density bonus law changes quickly. Density bonus law, as you probably all know, essentially says that local agencies are required to give qualifying projects additional density above what would otherwise be allowed by the local standards if the project qualifies as a qualifying project. And under state law in the last few years, it's been clarified that qualifying projects get a few things. They get the density bonus above and beyond what the density allowed under the local standards is. They get a specific number of what are called incentives and concessions, depending on the type of housing development and the affordability level that is being included in that housing element or housing project. They can seek waivers or reductions of development standards under subsection E, and they have to show that those standards, if applied, would physically preclude the construction of the development that they're proposing. So that's sort of similar to incentives and concessions, but separate. And then they get reductions in the minimum parking requirements that otherwise would be imposed by the local agency. So those are all the sort of benefits of proposing a density bonus project. And until last year, there were a number of qualifying project categories that have been sort of slowly expanded each year. And so most projects have to reserve a certain percentage for lower income or very low income households. There's now student projects. There's now projects that get a density bonus if they're catering specifically towards veterans who are disabled or transitional foster youth. But this last year, AB 1763 added a new qualifying project, which we sort of refer to as the 100% affordable. And what that project is where the project proposes to reserve at least 80%, but potentially all of the project for lower income households. And I say at least 80 because they could reserve 80% for lower income and up to the remaining 20% for moderate income households, but the entire thing has to be deed restricted for lower or moderate income households. If a project proposes that type of depth of affordability, they get some significant benefits above and beyond what the other eligible projects get. So whereas state law caps the density bonus that's required to be granted by state law for most projects at 35%, these 100% affordable projects get an 80% density bonus. They also get 4 incentives concessions, which means essentially 4 requests to deviate from otherwise applicable development standards. And they get even further benefits with respect to reductions in parking requirements. So this law clearly was intended to incentivize the development of wholly affordable, deed-restricted housing, and especially in places where there is available transit. So there are additional provisions with respect to these types of 100% affordable projects if they're located within half a mile of a major transit stop. They get an additional height increase of 3 stories or 33 feet, and a waiver from what they refer to as maximum controls on density. So these are some serious incentives to create these 100% affordable projects. So with respect to surplus lands, I just want to sort of highlight this with respect to city-owned property, that a local agency must take formal action at a regular public meeting to declare land that it owns to be either surplus land or exempt surplus land, which is and land not necessary for the local agency's use. And they have to do that before they take any action to dispose of the land. So this bill and this provision of state law is clearly intended to ensure that if there's available land that can be used for housing and also park and recreation purposes secondarily, then the state is now really trying to make sure that that land gets used for those purposes, and especially housing. So this new law under AB 1486 expanded the list of local agencies that are subject to these procedural requirements. So it's not just cities, counties, and districts anymore, but also joint powers authorities, successor agencies, housing authorities, and any other political subdivisions that are empowered to acquire and hold property. So any of those local agencies now need to consider what property they own and are going to be using for agency purposes, which really means that it's land that's being used or planned to be used pursuant to a written plan adopted by the local agency's governing board for agency work or operations. Okay, so before, the law did not include a definition of agency's use, and now it does. And it explicitly says that a piece of property is not being used for agency's use if it's being used for commercial or industrial uses, or being disposed of for the sole purpose of investment or generating revenue. So it limits what cities can do essentially with their property by placing a number of procedures on the process. So before the agency engages in negotiations with any entity to dispose of surplus land or disposes of the surplus land, the agency has to issue a notice of availability to a set of designated entities. And state law sort of enumerates who those entities are. It's essentially other public agencies, housing developers, and the like, to encourage the potential use of that property for housing. So before the agency engages in negotiations or disposes of the property, it has to issue a notice of availability. And if agencies, or rather designated entities, respond, the agency has to initiate good faith negotiations to try to come up with terms for the sale of that property. And there's a whole set of ways in which they're limited and must give priority to the use of that property for the development of low and moderate income housing. The caveat to that is if the property is already being used for park or recreational purposes, they can prioritize the sale or disposal of that property for park purposes. So if this doesn't actually require that a public agency sell the property to one of those designated entities, but it does require that they negotiate with them and try to come up with terms. And then ultimately they have to issue notice to HCD of the proposed terms if they do move forward with disposing of the property. And I should note that if the city does not agree to price and terms with a designated entity, or if in fact no designated entity responds to the notice of availability, the city can proceed to dispose of the property to any entity. That said, if the property ultimately is developed as housing and there are more than 10 or more residential units are ultimately developed on the property, at least 15% of the total units developed on the property must be rented to and available to low-income households through deed restrictions. There are a few caveats to these procedures, including properties that are already subject to exclusive negotiating agreements or legally binding agreements regarding the disposal of property. But just know for those public agencies that own property and are considering disposing of that property, there are some limitations on the procedures that those agencies now need to follow before they dispose of that property. And then finally, agencies are also required at this point to make a central inventory of surplus land and land in excess of foreseeable needs every year by December 31st. And then in the process of complying with the traditional annual progress reports for HCD, that list of surplus land and needs to be sent to HCD by April 1st. And the idea there being that HCD can then publish a statewide inventory to make it clear what lands are potentially available and owned by public agencies for the potential purpose of developing housing. So I've just got a couple more slides here with respect to AB 1483, which established some website requirements. Public agencies have to be mindful at this point that there's some new requirements with what needs to be available on their websites. So each agency needs to put up their current fees, exactions, and affordability requirements for housing. Again, this is in line with the attempt to create some certainty for applicants so they know what applies to their projects. Most agencies have a lot of this on their websites already, but it's a good practice to review and make sure that all available zoning, design, and development standards that might apply are also up on the website, including specific plans and the like. Again, those application completeness checklists under the Permit Streamlining Act need to be available and on the website. And then with respect to the potential fees that might be imposed, agencies need to have on their website the current and 5 prior annual fee reports under the Mitigation Fee Act, showing how the fees collected are being spent. And then include the impact fee nexus studies or cost of service studies that have been conducted since January 1st on the website as well, so that they know how they're calculating those impact fees. And then if any of this information is revised, the local agency has to update that information on its website within 30 days of the change. So just be mindful if you're amending zoning standards or fees, to be careful to make sure those are updated on the website. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dave Snow to move forward with CEQA.
Thanks, Diana. This past year, there were a couple of changes in CEQA, mostly minor, however. As in the past, a lot of discussion about CEQA, but not a lot of movement. But this year, there were a couple of movements. The first I'm going to talk about is the definition of a major transit stop. And there are some exemptions with respect to certain residential projects that are within 1/2 mile of a major transit stop. And this year, AB 1560 expanded that definition to include bus rapid transit. The rapid transit needs to have full-time dedicated bus lanes with defined stations, headways of less than 15 minutes during the AM and PM peak times, their commute times, transit signal priority, all door boarding, and a fare system that promotes efficiency. In addition, there were some clarifications regarding what a station means, and it's a clearly defined bus station that is served by the bus rapid transit, and that's relevant in some of the definitions with respect to when these exemptions would apply, in particular, the one for transit priority areas, 21099A7 in the Public Resources Code. So basically, if you got bus rapid transit and bus rapid transit stations, there's some expanded use of some of those exemptions. Next, we'll talk about interim motel housing projects. Senate Bill 450 added a new statutory exemption for interim motel housing. And like many of the other housing bills that Diana talked about, this is only through January 1 of 2025. We'll see if these all get extended, but for the time being, only through January 2025. This exempts certain conversions of motels, hotels, hostels, and residential hotels to supportive or transitional housing. There are certain criteria. The conversion must not expand the floor area of any living unit by more than 10%, and it can't result in significant effects to traffic, noise, air quality, or water quality. So statutory exemption, but there's still some check there with respect to traffic, noise, air quality, and water quality. Think about that perhaps along the lines of a class 32 to just show that they are not going to have those effects. But think about that even though it's still statutory. And the notice of exemption has to be filed with OPR, so that's a little different as well. All right, on our next slide, we will shift to supportive housing. As I'm sure we're all aware, there supportive housing that has to be by right if it meets certain criteria, and that would need to be processed ministerial and thus exempt from CEQA. There was prior legislation which made these uses by right in zones where mixed use or multifamily housing is a permitted use. There is a cap of 50 units to get that by right process if you're a jurisdiction with less than 200,000 people with 1,500 or fewer people experiencing homelessness. However, there was the opportunity to increase that cap as well. However, this year, if an agency is going to proceed with that increase in the cap, adopt local policies to do that, and there's now an exemption to do that. It authorizes also the exemption, or excuse me, the imposition of fees, exactions that are necessary to provide the public services and the facilities, but those cannot be based solely or partially on the status as a permanent supportive housing project or on the basis of the ministerial approvals. So you need to be careful on how those fees are enacted and implemented. And on our next slide, with respect to housing, the notices of exemption for the no place like home type projects, those are projects that are funded through the like home fund by others, and there's a program in the Institutions Code about that program. But basically, if it's exempt, then you file a notice of termination with OPR, and the filings must be filed with 2 working days rather than 5 days, which is the typical filing notice of exemption or notices of determination. 30 challenge period for these, and whether it's an exemption or not, and that is different than the 35-day challenge period that typically would apply for exemptions. And agency doesn't file on time, then that 30 days runs from either the day late filing or 90 days after that notice had to be filed. So 90 days after the 2 working days within which the notices needed to be filed. And again, those all go to OPR. All right, next I talk about low barrier navigation centers. This is a new concept that showed up in state law this year. It's housing first low barrier surf and risk shelters that focus on moving people into permanent housing. It's for temporary living. It has to have case management, connecting the homeless to public benefits, health services, shelter, and housing. And some of the barriers that are supposed to be addressed, or the low barriers, would include that it's not just the person, but their partners, their pets, and storage of possessions that have to be included for everything. However, those are some of the barriers that I think they're trying to deal with by calling it low barrier navigation centers. They also have to meet federal service related standards. It's an allowed use that's allowed by right in areas that are zoned for mixed use and residential zones that permit multifamily uses. There are certain criteria that they have to meet. They have to offer these services to connect people to permanent housing, and they need a service plan that actually identifies their staffing levels. They need to be linked to a coordinated entry system designed for intake, assessment, and referrals. They have to comply with certain welfare protection code requirements in respect to housing first. And they have to have a system that enters the information regarding housing or the client stays, the demographics, income, and exit destinations through a homeless management information system. And that is a system that is envisioned under federal law when there's certain funding involved. And so that is a system already in place, and they would need to be able to provide their facility information into that overall information system. Next, we are going to shift gears to safety elements. Obviously, in the last year, a couple of years, we've had the fire issues, flood issues that after the fires, and a number of safety issues that have come up as a result of that. This year, there was attention to that in a couple of ways. One is the natural infrastructure, that safety elements need to include climate adaptation and resiliency strategies. That's something that's already required, was already required, and needed to identify natural infrastructure. AB 65 updated that definition and broadened it. So instead of just purely natural infrastructure, it now can include systems and practices that use or mimic natural processes, including engineered systems like levees and whatnot. So need to reference the sustainable management of aquatic or terrestrial vegetated open spaces. And again, it broadens this ability to take into account engineered types of systems that mimic the natural infrastructure. And this is something that needs to be considered in the next safety element update. Evacuation routes was a topic of a couple of bills this year. SB 99 requires the review and update of the safety element to identify residential developments that are in hazard areas and that don't have 2 emergency evacuation routes. So that's something that needs to be looked at, and a deadline for that is the next time the housing element is updated on or after January 1, 2020. So if you're working on your housing element updates, add this to the category to go along with those. There was another bill, AB 747, that also dealt with evacuation route updates. And this expands the requirements for safety elements to identify evacuation routes and their capacity, the safety, and the viability of those routes. So I think more detail than likely would have been included in the past. And this is in the range of various emergency scenarios. So maybe a fire scenario, maybe a flood scenario, et cetera, and seeing what the capacity, safety, and viability of those evacuation routes are. And presumably, if they're not adequate, look at other ways to try and address those issues. This update is tied to the next update of the local hazard mitigation plan after January 1 of 2022. So a little different deadline on this one. And if your agency had not, for whatever reason, adopted a local hazard mitigation plan, then the deadline is January 2022. So maybe it ends up getting folded in together with the emergency evacuation route work for SB 99, but the deadlines are different in the 2 bills. All right, a couple of quick hit miscellaneous items. There were some past year with respect to licensed family daycare homes. As you're aware, small family daycare homes have been exempt from regulation and license requirements for time. This year, SB 234, its goal of reducing costs and further improving access to childcare, legislates that the larger family daycare homes, those that were from 7 to 14, depending on the makeup of the children who were being served, that those need to be permitted like other residences and residential uses in the zone. And so, whereas before there was an opportunity to require a large family daycare planning approval of some sort, that is no longer the case. So now the large family daycare homes need to be treated like small family daycare homes. City and counties can impose space, or cannot, excuse me, impose space and concentration standards, impose traffic, parking, or noise controls, or require a business license. I think from a noise perspective, this doesn't mean that they're allowed to violate your general nuisance standards, but imposing specific noise controls, which may have been done through the prior review and permit scheme, would no longer be allowed. The local agencies can impose the generally applicable height, setback, and lot standards on the same terms as for other residential development, however. There are some new expansions of the large daycare facility homes that they have to be allowed in a variety of multifamily residences as well, including a single family residence in a multifamily zone, townhomes, dwelling units within a dwelling unit, which is the specific language in the statute. However, sounds like that may be referring to an ADU, but they didn't choose to use that term. And also in multifamily dwellings in zones that allow residential use. So daycare facilities and multifamily residences is something that's a little more easy now with this new legislation. Next, I'm going to touch on briefly photovoltaic requirements related to disaster repair. AB 178 deals with residential construction and repairs after a disaster, limited to areas that were declared as states of emergency. They only need to comply with the solar photovoltaic requirements that were in effect when the structure was originally constructed if certain criteria are met. Number one, the owner's incomes need to be below or equal the county median income level. The square footage of the residence can't exceed the size when it was damaged. No code upgrade insurance was in place at the time of the damage. If someone had the code upgrade requirements, then they would be expected to comply with the current standards. It's new construction that's on the same site, so you can't put it on another site, which makes. So again, in those areas that impacted by fire and flood, on the protections from some of the new photovoltaic requirements. Warehouse distribution centers has been topic of issues for a number of communities and subject of CEQA lawsuits and other things as well, various challenges. But this year, AB 485 focused on the economic subsidies that might be provided to these types of uses and added to some already existing reporting requirements. The new reporting requirements and procedures relate to subsidies that are over $100,000 to warehouse distribution centers. They cannot require non-disclosure agreements as part of the negotiation. So basically, the public would have access to the information regarding the negotiations and subsidies. The new reporting requirements include the estimated number of temporary agency workers or temp workers, not permanent employees that would be employed, information regarding the benefits packages that are offered to employees, health benefits and other such things, outreach, training and hiring plans that include disadvantaged workers, as that term is defined in the statute. The total of the state and federal subsidies that are for and or received for the project. Accountability measures if the contract goals are not met. So if there are certain goals that are part of the economic subsidies agreement, whether that's jobs or other such things, what are accountability measures that are built into the contract if those goals are not met, and the net job loss or replacement that might be resulting from artificial intelligence, automation, and other such technologies. A fair amount of detail that is expected to be reported for those projects receiving the economic subsidies. All right, and we're getting close to the end here. This is where we would normally maybe give a little preview of what's going to be coming up with the future legislation. There are, as you expect, a number of housing bills that were still in play during this legislative cycle and this year. However, with Sacramento slowing down like all the rest of us, the legislature is not to convene for another couple of weeks until May 4th. There have been calls for streamlining and fixing the legislative agenda and the bills that legislators are pushing forward. We'll see how that goes. But at this point, it's kind of difficult to know what might move and what the focuses may be this coming year with the COVID-19 issues that everyone will be working through and with. So rather than talk about what may or may not end up on the legislative cycle, we thought we'd spend just a couple minutes talking about the topic du jour, COVID-19, and some issues for planners that have come up with respect to land use approvals. There were a number of questions on whether the various emergency orders that have been by the state had any impact on the various deadlines that planners work with, whether that's the Permit Streamlining Act, MAP Act deadlines, the Housing Accountability Act deadlines, the ADU deadlines, the Streamlined Housing Approvals under SB 35, wireless facility shot clock requirements. At this point, there is nothing that's been specifically addressed in the various emergency orders. APA at the state level has reached out to the governor's office and tried to get some relief for these deadlines. At this point, it hasn't gotten traction. I should note that the League of California Cities has also been working on that, but at this point, it hasn't gotten any traction. So there's no specific rules that would toll those deadlines. So be aware of those deadlines. Probably best to try and comply with those deadlines if you're a public agency, a lawyer, planner, as much as possible. And just think about if there are issues. Tracking the deadlines is always important. But look at some of the opportunities, whether it's Permit Streamlining Act for the completeness reviews to get extensions and work on reasonable extensions with developers or applicants, similar flexibility under the Division MAP Act, and just think about those tools and try and work with applicants to document deadlines if it looks like you're not, or some extensions if it looks like you aren't going to be able to meet the deadlines. And with that, that brings us to the end of our presentation. We have time for a couple of questions, and I know we've got a final slide about some upcoming Orange County APA stuff. So.
Thank you so much, Dave and Diana both. We do actually have a couple questions. One question that seemed to have a couple different requests had to do with fees. And the first one comes from Nate Farnsworth. And he asked, are special districts still allowed to charge fees for ADUs that are less than 750 square feet? Or does the law only apply to local governments? And as a follow-up to that one has to do with, do school fees apply to ADU? And that's asked by Carlos Jaramillo.
That's a great question. And I wish I had the answer off the top of my head, and I don't. So the state law defines impact fees to include QIMBY fees. So it definitely includes park fees that would be limited to those. And any other fee that constitutes a Mitigation Fee Act fee. It does not explicitly refer to school district fees as far as I remember. And I'm not sure if Dave has a more definitive answer to that. But I think one of the challenges about these fee provisions is the language that is used in, especially the ADU bill generally. There are a lot of ambiguities, so there's a lot that's not entirely clear. So I would say if you're concerned about that, talk to your legal counsel, and that's probably my caveat and disclaimer for most of these questions. But explicitly it limits impact fees subject to the Mitigation Fee Act and fees that are Quimby Act park fees. Otherwise, it does not explicitly refer to the types of fees that need to be limited pursuant to the size distinction.
Great, thanks guys. This is Patrick. I've got a question here from Anna Pahushik. I follow up on SB 333. How does SB 333 or 30 apply to a situation where information is submitted in response to an incomplete letter and the city has questions or requests, requests more information based on subsequent materials submitted?
That's a great question. And this is part of the challenge of the state laws that sort of govern how local agencies should be interacting with applicants. Because all local agencies sort of have their back and forth with applicants, and we all know that when you work at the local level, that there are always going to be clarifying questions. So public agencies still definitely can request clarifying information. I would be mindful of the timelines for complying with the responses when something is complete and not complete, and just make sure you're working with your legal counsel to make sure you don't miss any of those deadlines. But I think there's always room to request clarifying information. So that would be my position on that.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, I think just if there's brand new information that comes in response to a legitimate incompleteness item, I think just you have to have the ability to look into that and follow up on it. A developer may argue about that, but I think that it only makes sense to be able to follow up on that new information.
All right, great. Our next question has to do with SB 330 as well. And the question comes from Jaime Murillo, and it's a two-part. Does SB 330 definition of housing development projects, specifically residential units only, apply to a single family development? And then the example he has is, can a property owner demolish an old triplex and construct a single family home in its place? Or would 3 units need to be replaced on site? The term residential units only is plural.
You have asked the million-dollar question. And I would say, again, state law is not entirely clear in all instances. I think the Housing Accountability Act certainly was intended to encourage the development of multifamily housing. And so I think that's a question for conversation with your legal counsel on how your city is going to interpret state law with respect to the definition of housing development project. But you note a fair ambiguity.
Great. The next question comes from Luis Escobedo. Can agencies regulate the number of bedrooms in an ADU?
The state law is silent on that. I think the state law explicitly says what you can regulate with respect to the size of an ADU based on the number of bedrooms. But state law is silent on regulating the number of bedrooms that a local agency can have. I think there are arguments going either way. I'm sort of the mindset that the size restriction is probably the best way to go from a local perspective. Just focus on the size, not necessarily the number of bedrooms. But I do think that the state law's silence leaves a little room there for agencies, if they're concerned about it, to argue that they can do that.
All right, back to SB 330. There were a lot of questions on that one. What about?
It's understandable.
Yeah. What about if the existing dwelling units are a non-conforming number of units that are no longer allowed?
That would be the second million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Again, I think that's a moment for conversation with your legal counsel. It's not entirely clear what happens in those instances, and to point out another point of that replacement unit requirements, what it's really trying to do is maintain the number of units that's on the property now if you're proposing housing. And so there are some strange limitations to that language. So the way that it's structured is that the agency shall not approve a housing development project. So the project being proposed must be housing. if it does not comply with the replacement unit requirements, both with respect to number and then with respect to the affordability level, if that's necessary. So I would say, you know, I don't think it changes the local agency's authority to impose its existing zoning code, but that's not entirely clear how you comply with these particular requirements in the situation that you brought up. So I would say definitely talk to your legal counsel on that one.
Yeah, and I would just add to that if you've got that type of constraint, it's probably something you would want to think about and look into as part of your housing element update, and see whether that's a way to look for additional available sites or other such things, or removing a constraint. So there are other kind of policy ways to take a look at that as well.
Great, and then another follow-up for 330. This comes from Chris Chung, and it starts with the quote, multiple accessory dwelling units within portions of existing multifamily dwelling structures that are not used as livable space, including but not limited to storage rooms, boiler rooms, passageways, attics, basements, or garages, if each unit complies with state building standards for dwellings. Does this include any such detached structures, or must these structures be attached to one or more of the existing multifamily dwelling units?
So I think what you're referring to there, Chris, is the requirement in section 65852.2E that requires local agencies to issue a building permit for certain types of accessory dwelling units. And that category you're talking about are the conversions of non-livable space in existing multifamily structures. I would say that because it says in the existing multifamily structure, there's a pretty strong argument that that non-livable space needs to be essentially in the building. But again, as with many of these instances, there's some ambiguity in that provision. And so I think different agencies might be interpreting that differently. So that's something to think about a little bit further. And as you noted, the fourth category there is the authority to build new detached ADUs on a property with an existing multifamily dwelling. So again, that's the provision there that talks about detached ADUs, which is separate from the conversion of livable space in existing multifamily dwellings.
All right, well, those are all the questions that we have. If anybody wants to submit some more, I think we can try to, but I just want to thank both of you so much for helping and guiding us through these ever more complicated regulations, especially as we're coming up on a new housing cycle. I'm sure we're going to have a lot more questions to come, but thank you so much for being here. And we actually did just get one more question. Why don't we take this last one if you guys are okay with that?
Sure.
It says that this is from Chad, or I'm sorry if I'm gonna murder this last name, Ortlieb. Government Code section 65852.22 talks about an ADU in proposed space of an existing single family dwelling. Could proposed space mean new square footage onto an existing ADU for purposes of an attached ADU?
So 0.22 refers to the junior accessory dwelling unit provisions. And so as I read the definition of junior accessory dwelling, it is within the walls of a single family dwelling. So a JADU has to be contained entirely within the walls of a single family dwelling. What it does not talk about in 0.22 is whether that can be within the walls of an existing single family dwelling or within the walls of a slightly expanded single family dwelling, which is the situation I think you're talking about. But then when you look at 65852.2E, I don't think it refers to developing a JADU within an expansion of an existing single family dwelling under that provision. So I think, again, different cities, depending on how how much they were wanting to encourage these types of uses might be more expansive in their local regulations, but I don't think the state law mandates that local agencies allow a property owner to essentially expand their single family home to build a JADU or ADU under E1.
The only thing I would add is that the questions focused right in on issues that we've been struggling with. So good job, planners.
Yeah, absolutely. You guys have touched on the most challenging aspects of the ADU law, and especially SB 330. And those replacement unit provisions are a quagmire. So if you're dealing with proposed housing development projects, you need to unfortunately become quite familiar with those new replacement unit requirements for any project that's being proposed on a site with existing housing. And that very well will involve discussions with legal teams.
Well, thank you so much again. There was a lot of dense information in there. I'm sure that we're all going to want to go back and reference this. So just for everybody watching, or if you know somebody that wasn't able to watch today, this webinar will be uploaded to our OCAPA website, and the information is provided on the slide here. And that should take us a couple days to upload. Also, we are currently in the process of uploading our legislative update page for the chapter. We're having some technical issues there, so be patient with us, but in the next couple days, that will be up to date as well. And finally, the state has asked us to let everybody know that Cal APA is putting together their Plan California legislative platform, and that'll be available for review at, it looks to be like fall, so please take a look at that when it comes available and provide any comments, because it helps APA build what their direction is going to be for California. And then lastly, just because everybody is worried about this or needs them, is AACP credits of 1.5 are available for this, and the information is at the bottom as well. So thank you so much again, everyone, and have a great day, and hopefully everyone is staying safe and healthy out there.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thanks.